Summer, winter, it's a big world. I'm Ellie Noam.
Lauren Chambers has joined the meeting. Michael Kent has joined the meeting. Nanette Levinson has joined the meeting.
Okay, that needs to go down.
ICC has joined the meeting. Jamal Shahan has joined the meeting.
What the hell is
Jolie,
this?
can you check your settings? I think you might have turned something on.
Never heard that one before. Hi, Robin.
IGF Secretariat has joined
Not
the
me,
meeting.
it's someone with a screen reader, I guess.
Oh la la, somebody's got to fix that.
Jason, what do we do?
I'm looking on my end. Give me 1 second.
Milton Mueller to everyone. It's AI out of control.
Oh my God.
I thought
I suspect it's Milton Mueller who's out of control. Milton, are you behind this? It wouldn't surprise me.
True. Milton's sabotaging us. AI in the wild. It's the AI Armageddon I've been reading all about.
All right, so whoever I muted was the problem because it didn't just screen read out Milton's comment. So
Okay, that's good.
Ellie, you're good to go.
All right. Andiamo.
Ellie, you're muted.
Why you cannot remove me?
Ellie, you're still muted.
All right, if you have solved the problem, I can get to start. Hi, I'm Eli Noam. I'm the director of the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation, a research center for those of you who are new to these events. There we have
At Mike Nelson, at Carnegie, and now to everyone. That's too many people have already done that.
Somebody, please.
Ellie, go ahead.
Okay, so at CITI, Columbia University Institute for Teleinformation, we have been for 40 years doing economic and policy analysis of
Jiyoung-hee Kim,
media,
ITU
communications,
has joined the
and the
meeting.
digital society.
Henriette Esther Wisen to everyone. True Mike.
Many books, articles, conferences. We hold webinars, for example, here, and I usually open them with some overview or context or questions. And I try to represent those people involved.
Bill
in
Drake
the
to everyone.
area in
Stop
general, but
laughing,
not
Milton.
Ellie, it's on your end. You've got transcription turned on. Can you please check your screen and turn it off? You're also muted. Ellie, you're muted. You're still muted. You're still muted.
All right. Not sure what you heard now. So I usually open with some overview and context and questions.
Dr. Swati Butte has joined.
Ellie, I'm gonna have to mute you, and we're gonna have to move on because it's on your end. I'll connect and call you, but Bill, if you want to just get started, I'll just mute Ellie. Bill, you're muted. Unmute.
For God's sakes, sorry. All right, Ellie, you can just, when we get to the Q&A part, just jump in there and add whatever your thoughts are, and they'll be fine. I'm not sure where Nigel is, but hopefully he's showing up soon. But we will get started anyway. Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Drake, and this is the seminar on global digital governance. This is the 7th entry into our series that we've been running all this year, the last one of the semester, of the academic year here at Columbia. The videos and transcripts of the previous sessions are all available if you're interested on the website linked to the announcement that you saw for this event. Today, we are going to be talking about the new proposal from the United Nations Secretary-General for the creation of a UN Digital Cooperation Forum. Just a couple of minutes of background from me on that, and then I'll introduce the panel, one of whom is still missing. If you've been around the internet governance space for a long time and you have a sense of deja vu about this, you're not alone. We've all been through this before, for sure. In the 21st century, we've had a range of proposals to create new broadly focused one-stop shop kind of institutional arrangements for global internet and digital governance issues. This has yielded one notable success, obviously, the launch of the Internet Governance Forum in 2006. Otherwise, these efforts have generally produced fairly little. On the intergovernmental side, we've seen all kinds of proposals during the 2002 to 2005 WSIS negotiations. Many governments were advocating for creating some sort of new body with great centralized powers over the internet, or transferring such powers to the International Telecommunication Union. When we had the working group on internet governance appointed by Kofi Annan, that some of us participated in, states insisted on adding 3 different competing formulations for new organizations that would have oversight over the DNS and operations of ICANN and so on. Later, we had proposals from India for a UN committee for internet-related policies that would have broad powers. We had 2 cycles of working groups on enhanced cooperation in 2013 to 14, and again, 2016 to 2018, in which a number of governments pushed for the creation of some sort of new intergovernmental body with broad centralized authority over the internet, even though it was understood by everybody that that would never happen, and the conversation blocked out any effort to figure out how to actually enhance cooperation in existing institutions and make it more compatible with developing country interests. We had in the various UN General Assembly reviews of the WSIS, various proposals put forward by governments, certain governments, we all know who, for the creation of new organizations with centralized powers. And on the multi-stakeholder side also, we had various proposals over the past 20 years. You may recall the panel organized by Estonian President Ilves that suggested a new architecture of distributed governance groups. The Net Mondial initiative tried to put forward similar ideas, and there were various other kinds of proposals. And what all these proposals for broad scoped organizations and processes had in common was that none of them went anywhere. From a functional and operational standpoint, in every case, there was a lack of clarity about the scope of the issues that would be covered, the structure and modalities of cooperation, the nature of the outputs, and so on. And from a political standpoint, there was always inadequate levels of consensus and buy-in among all states and stakeholders that would be needed to make something happen. This is the kind of stuff that international relations scholars spend all their time trying to explain. Of course, more recently, we've had a spate of new frameworks being established for particular kinds of issues, issue-specific frameworks for AI, platforms, things like that, in bodies like the Council of Europe, European Union, and so on, but no new formal organizations yet being created there to manage those things. So policy authority over a lot of digital issues remains dispersed across multiple institutional spaces with varying levels of participation. And there are always people who advocate the need for some sort of one-stop shop with broad multilateral participation that all countries, all governments can participate in under the aegis of the United Nations. And that's been a leitmotif for the past 20 years. And it's in that context then that we have the UN Secretary-General Guterres' introduction of the Global Digital Compact Initiative as part of his broader UN reform agenda over the past couple of years. In 2019, we had the high-level panel on digital cooperation, which put forward 3 alternative architectures for digital cooperation that didn't really go forward, but led to a couple of innovations, the establishment of a leadership panel for the IGF and the hiring of a technology envoy in 2022, that position, of course, being held by Amandeep Singh Gill, who we'll be talking about later, probably. And subsequently then, there's been a lot of process through under Guterres with the roadmap on digital cooperation, various informal consultations with members about different digital issues, although not this proposal for a new forum. And the issue brief that was released then in May and that the Secretary General introduced to the General Assembly in June, which is the basis of this meeting, in which the idea of a new UN Digital Cooperation Forum was proposed. Next steps are going to be in the summer, development of an issues paper, and then that will be presented to a ministerial meeting in September that's supposed to help tee up further work on the digital compact, global digital compact, with an eye towards the UN Summit on the Future in 2024. and then the WSIS World Summit on Information Society review in 2025, where the IGF's mandate will be reviewed. It seemed clear from the outset of this whole high-level process in 2019 that there'd be eventually a proposal for new organization. That's almost always the standard operating procedure in a lot of these international policy spaces. You identify a problem and you say, well, we need an organization to manage it. And during WSIS, we often heard many government and UN people say things like, we have an organization for transportation, we have an organization for pollution, why don't we have an organization for the internet? I mean, if must be one organization for each policy problem. So now we have that proposal for a new organization outlined in the May brief. It's part of a larger set of proposals from the Secretary-General for new processes on a range of different issues, including platforms and so on. The under 2 pages that describe the Digital Cooperation Forum reads in a manner that's strikingly similar to the Internet Governance Forum mandate that was written by the WIGIG in 2005 and approved by the WSIS. If you read the thing, it's interesting. There are a few differences between the IGF. They're notable, but there's a lot of overlap. The substantive focus is on specified and unlimited. It seems to be any and all digital stuff. Presumably, the internet is not off limits. The mandate calls for facilitating transparent dialogue and collaboration, knowledge and information sharing, pooling, learning, and promoting cross-border learning, identifying policy gaps and possible solutions, all the stuff that the IGF is asked to do. It's a non-negotiating body forum, just like the IGF. Participation in decision-making would be a bit different. It says in the report that while a global framework should be driven by member states, the involvement of private sector and civil society is essential. So instead of multi-stakeholder decision-making, it sounds like it would be multi-stakeholder consultation into a government-driven process. So it seems to be the. And the forum would be based on tripartite engagement of government, business, and civil society. One may ask, where's the internet technical community in there? Apparently, they are deemed to be part of civil society, which is interesting. They are independently represented, of course, in the IGF, the OECD, and so on. Instead of a MAG like the IGF has, there would be a tripartite advisory group, a TAG, that would plan the annual event. And there'd be an annual report from the Secretary-General. And all of this would exist happily in an ecosystem in a hub and spoke way with existing bodies, including the IGF. So you'd have in Geneva a multi-stakeholder process talking about digital issues, and you'd have in New York an intergovernmental process talking about digital issues, and there'd be no overlap. So some interesting questions there. So there's a lot to talk about here. It's important because they're looking to try to put forward a issues paper for September when the ministers meet. And to do that, we're going to have 3 experts who've been long involved in all these discussions. Fiona Alexander is Distinguished Policy Strategist in Residence at the School of International Service and as Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Internet Governance Lab at American University. Previously, for 20 years, Fiona was at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the U.S. Department of Commerce, where she was Associate Administrator for International Affairs. That's kind of a bureaucratic way of saying she was in charge of international policy. Henriette Esterhuizen is a Senior Advisor for Internet Governance at the Association for Progressive Communication, the APC. She was APC's Executive Director from 2000 to 2017 and served as Chair of the IGF's Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group from 2019 to 2021. Henriette was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame in 2013, and she's joining us from South Africa, hopefully with sufficient bandwidth to get through the meeting. And we have Nigel Hickson, who works on internet governance at the United Kingdom's Department of Science, Innovation, and Technology, where, among other roles, he's the UK representative on the Government Advisory Committee to the ICANN, in ICANN. From 2012, he worked for ICANN in Brussels and Geneva before returning to the UK government in 2020 to work on Brexit-related data protection issues. So that's our panel. That's the background. That's our panel. The mechanics will be, as always, we'll do 4 rounds of tour de table, informal conversation. Then at the top of the hour, we'll move towards open discussion. I see we have a good turnout of a lot of people who are fairly knowledgeable in this area. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to have a lively and interactive conversation. That's the game.
Thank you very much, Bill. Let me, before the questions get into the details, tell them and you, and I'm trying to represent here, as I always do, the people who are interested in the subject, but not part of the charmed circle of people who meet and talk to each other about internet governance continuously. And they and I would like to understand certain basic things, which I hope that will be discussed here, which we hope that we will learn at the end of this meeting. Question, what is the problem that requires a new initiative? What is the problem that requires a new initiative? Second, isn't there already a respectable international organizational effort in place to deal with this problem? What else do we need? There are about 20, by my count, UN organized initiatives in this area. Why this? Third, will the new forum make a difference? Fourth, why is this initiative happening in political terms? What is behind it beyond the official documents? Fifth, is it even possible to reach an international shared vision that goes beyond platitudes? And is it even desirable? And sixth and last, what is the perspective on all of this by the tech community? Not just big tech, that's easy, but also by the smaller innovators. And I hope that at the end of this hour and a half, I and the rest of the audience will understand some more about the answers to these questions.
Thanks, Ellie. Those are all questions that we intended to address. So if you could put your hand down so I could drag Nigel's picture to the front of the screen, please. It won't let me do it until you let go. All right, so now I can see all of our speakers together. Same place. So let's begin then. Let's start with the discussion indeed of what are we talking about? How did we get here? The who, what, why, how of all this for folks who are not deeply entrenched in all this stuff. So starting with the who question, who wants a new digital cooperation forum? What's the political market demand for such a creature? What kind of structures are being proposed here, really? I mean, I gave an outline of what's in the document, but there's obviously more to it than that. Why? What's the substantive case that's being made for why we need such a thing? And it has to be in New York, et cetera, in the way that it is. And how is this process conceived and promoted into the international sphere? These are among some of the questions I think it'd be good to just get on the table for starters. Who would like to begin? Amy, just raise your hand, or I'll just call it. Fiona, why don't you start for us?
Hi everyone. And everyone that known for a long time. I was part of Ellie's Charmed group, I guess, which is a new title, I guess I can add to my resume. I'm not actually sure why this is needed, and I think that's something that we can talk about. But I do feel like that the more and more technology pervades every part of everyone's life, everyone thinks they have a say and everyone wants to be a part of it. And there's a lack of understanding. There's a lack of shared history of the last 20 years, even amongst newer people in government agencies, I think. But everyone's looking for a way to have a role and to solve a problem that they think exists. I think one of the things that would be interesting to discuss on this conversation and hear from others is, we did agree to create the Internet Governance Forum now almost 20 years ago. And is part of what's happening a result of people not getting what they want out of the IGF. And so they are looking for another venue to have a conversation. Is part of this just new people wanting to put their imprimatur and have a say? Is part of this the desire to actually have a conversation in New York versus Geneva or other UN hubs? And I think that's actually something worth drilling down to. In previous cycles, we weren't thrilled about having some of these conversations in the UN broadly, but having them in ITU or in other parts of the world where you actually had more expert agency participations, even amongst government experts, more expert agencies versus New York. New York tends to be very politicized and very political with a capital P. And so maybe this proposal just reflects the reality of technology issues becoming more politicized in that way. But from my perspective, and some of the questions that Ellie laid out, I don't know what problem we're trying to solve. I don't think there's a lack of UN effort across the UN family addressing these issues. And in fact, this seems to ignore some of that and actually not take advantage of the existing agencies. And I don't think that anything that comes out of this will make a big difference either, because I'm not sure that there's big buy-in. So I think maybe I would just offer those as opening remarks to what you've asked and what Ellie mentioned.
Okay, great. Nigel or Andrea, whichever you'd like to jump in, just please do.
I can jump in, Bill. I don't think I'll switch off my camera. My connection is bad. Great questions, Ellie. I agree as well. I think, well, firstly, I do think there is an institutional gap. I think that digitalization is broader than internet governance, and it's bringing new challenges. I think there's been a big shift since WSIS. WSIS was all about the opportunity and the potential of ICTs and the internet for development, for better governance, for enabling human rights. And I think what's happened in the last 20 years, unfortunately, in my view, is that there's much more of a concern about not the positive potential of the internet, but the potential for harm. And in fact, I think there's a preoccupation, a disproportionately large preoccupation with the potential for harm. But it's real. People feel seriously about it. Government feels serious about it. Many users do. I think the UN system itself is not coordinating internally. There is a body called UNGIS, the UN Group for the Information Society, which is made up of representation from UNESCO, the ITU, the IGF, and so on, CSDD. But it's not really functioning effectively. I think the IGF itself has failed to evolve as maybe not as a platform, because if you look at the IGF agenda and what people talk about at the IGF, it's very broad. It's not just internet governance. It's everything from AI to platform regulation. But the IGF as a I don't want to say institution, because it isn't really as an institution, but it hasn't actually succeeded in galvanizing this massive bottom-up network that animates it and extracting knowledge and discussion and debate effectively from it. And then I think the other reason that there is some kind of need is that governments are playing power games. We have the Declaration of the Future of the Internet, a new set of principles coming from the US, with the EU endorsing it very actively. We have, again, I think, some kind of move towards good governments and bad governments, which I think is really unfortunate. And I think this is also, takes us far away from that WSIS vision of an inclusive internet, inclusive use of ICTs. So maybe there is a need, but when it comes to whether this initiative is actually going to effectively fulfill this need, I agree completely with Fiona. I don't think it will. I don't think it's going about it in the right way. It's not really building on what is in place. It's not building on WSIS. It's not building on the GGE, the norms on responsible state behavior in cyberspace. It's not building on the experience and the practice of the IGF, on the network of the IGF, the vast national and regional IGF network. And I don't think it's really inclusive either, so in terms of how it's approaching the multi-stakeholder model and the multi-stakeholder, what we've learned about what works about it and what does not work about it. So I think I'm not very hopeful that it's actually going to succeed, but I do not think that there is no need whatsoever. I think just one little thing that's in the Global Digital Compact, the notion of digital public goods, for example, I think it's a conversation that we haven't really had about the internet, the publicness of the internet, or the role of the internet and creating public goods. So there are lots of conversations that we need to have. I'm just not convinced that it's going about it in a way that's going to fill all these gaps that I've outlined.
Well, perhaps I'll
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Amjad. Nigel, go ahead.
No, not at all. Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to take part in such a discussion. And thanks for the opening remarks, Ellie, and thanks Fiona and Henriette. So, is it déjà vu? That was a question posed in the chat, and I think the answer is no. I think some of us are sometimes guilty about saying that these existential crises in internet governance go in waves, and to an extent, perhaps history has shown us they do go in waves from 2005 onwards, so to speak. But I think this is something different, and we'll perhaps get on to some of the process and the structural issues later. But in terms of who wants it and why it's needed, I think we really have to reflect on not what we in the UK or not what you might in the US or what some of the other sort of Western or real countries have. We need to reflect on the needs and aspirations of a great deal of other countries. Yes, it's very easy for the UK to go along to the G7. Yeah, we can say things at the G7. It's very easy for us to go along to the OECD. It's very easy to us to go on to be, well, I was going to say it's easy to speak in the European Union, but actually it's not very easy for the UK to speak in the European Union anymore, but within the European club, if you like. But for many countries, their voice is less able to be heard, perhaps. And we hear this at the ITU. A number of countries asked at the plenipotentiary, where can we raise cybersecurity treaties then? Where can we raise internet governance issues if we can't raise it at the ITU? Where can we raise disinformation? Where can we raise other issues that countries are facing in terms of behaviors on the internet? And I think to an extent the UN has responded to this, whether it's something in the water or whatever. I think the Secretary-General has caught the vibe. I mean, they've certainly caught the vibe on artificial intelligence, but before that, I think they were catching the vibe on digital, that there is something here. There are legitimate concerns of a number of countries, as we've heard from the G77 and other countries. And the UN is a forum where people want to go and discuss these issues. So I don't think we should be surprised. And I don't think that, this is something that's just going to go away. Now, in terms of the structures and in terms of what happens, well, I think it's to be decided. But I certainly don't think that, it's something we could ignore. I think it's something that we're going to have to work with. The question is, of course, how we're going to work with it, what structures it needs, and what the outcome might be. But I think those are secondary questions in terms of the need for us all to respond to some of these issues. And I think Henriette was completely right when she said it's not internet governance anymore. In particular, we term it internet governance. We obviously discuss internet governance issues in a number of places, but it's really wider than that. Some of the issues we're seeing, and it's not so much to the governance of the internet, although that is still argued about. It's really the governance on the internet and how different countries can cope with with what's going on. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. So I think we've heard very kind of different views in our opening approach, which is great. So on the one hand, there's the argument that there is gaps and that Henriette put forward, and that there's a desire among governments and other actors to see those gaps addressed in some manner. And you have Nigel making the argument that there's a need for multilateral inclusive stuff, but at the same time, there is some skepticism about that Fiona expressed and others about the particular formulation. The question, of course, is if there are gaps, and of course, you remember that in the working group and enhanced cooperation, we spent a lot of time trying to identify gaps that went on for months and months, trying to list what are the issues that somehow are orphaned and not being taken care of anywhere. At the end of the day, that effort came to very little real consensus about what was orphaned, because in fact, many issues are being taken up in different places. They're just not being taken up in the places that some people want them taken up. And so the argument is, yes, there's work being done on platforms and AI and this and that and the other, but it's not being done in a broad multilateral setting like the UN, and so therefore. So that's, I guess, part of the argument. Let's talk about the second aspect of this, the relationship to the IGF. As I noted in my introduction, with the exception of the implied scope, which seems to be, digital beyond the internet, digital everything, and the annual report that would be generated by the Secretary-General, much of the way the mandate is written sounds exactly like the IGF. And so the question is, what do we make of that? I mean, what's really going on here between New York, UN members, and the IGF, that there seems to be a proposal to do something like the IGF, but do it not in Geneva in a multi-stakeholder way, but in New York in a more government-led way, with this hub and spokes system that is outlined in the report, where these two very different processes would coexist alongside each other. Would that be stable when we get to time for the IGF mandate to be renewed at the WSIS plus 20 in 2025? If there's a digital cooperation forum, will the governments that have opposed the IGF in the past say, well, we've got the digital cooperation forum, why do we need an internet governance forum that does the same thing? There's a lot of questions around here. So let's talk about the nexus between the IGF and this new concept. Who'd like to start with that? I'll just go in the same order. How about Fiona? How about we just go alphabetical?
So I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm sort of struck by the repeated attempts to do the same thing over and over. And I think Bill kind of laid them out. The Net Mundial initiative, I think, was a similar exercise, right? Which was there gaps and where should there be gaps? And can you do a hub and spoke kind of thing? I think the enhanced cooperation exercise tried to do the same thing at some level. And so I'm a little bit perplexed as to why a conversation driven out of New York, where the conversations are political, and driven by geopolitics, would make a difference. There has always been a conversation in New York on these issues. Every year in September, there was an annual ICT for D resolution, which some folks may remember or may not have been involved in. And these issues always came up in that regard as well. It was a one resolution thing and a one-day thing, many weeks leading up to it, but it was always there. So I'm just a little bit perplexed as to and maybe this is what we need to dig into deeper, which is why are all these efforts to address the same gap or perceived gap don't work, right? And where do they fall apart? Part of the challenge, I think, for the IGF and for the longevity of the IGF is getting everybody to show up. And over the years, Western governments have shown up at IGF, and in some cases, developing country governments have participated in bigger numbers than others. But IGF really has a big influx and participation by the civil society and academia, the internet technical community, and private sector participation ebbs and flows. And so, I get the corollary here is maybe you have the same conversation, but you have governments leading the charge. And again, I don't disagree that you need to have multilateral conversations on these issues. The ITU Council Working Group on Internet, I think, which Nigel went to for many years, also is a similar exercise, right? And that didn't work either. So I'm just really skeptical that a conversation based in New York, which, the agenda and the capacity and the skill sets of the folks that represent the member states in New York are not deep in technical skills. That's not what they're there for. How serious of a conversation can you have at an annual meeting in New York where you have the people from the missions in New York try to talk about very technical or very challenging issues without those conversations? So I think part of the issue for me.
Somebody needs to mute. Thank you. Go ahead, Fiona.
No, I'm good.
Okay, I take your point. That was great. Thanks. Henriette?
Maybe I'm not. Maybe just one thing before Henriette starts. This terminology issue is something that would be helpful to dig into too, because internet governance versus digitalization versus cyber, everybody means something slightly different when they talk about it. And I think people are always all talking past each other as well. The way I read the working definition of internet governance, all of these things could fit into it if you wanted to so define it that way. So that's, I think, part of the challenge. Sometimes it's a purposeful use of a different word, and other times it's just, not understanding or not wanting to have all these things fit into one word. There's no reason why you couldn't take the IGF and make it the IGF plus or the variations of the things that have been proposed and have this as the place to deal with all these issues if there was the political will and the will of the stakeholder community to make it happen.
Great, and that I want to come back to that option, IGF plus in a minute. Andrea?
Thanks, Bill. I agree with Fiona completely. I'm not going to put my camera on. Sorry, my connection. I keep getting a message. It's unstable. I think there's a certain lack of rigor in the policy brief. You know, with all due respect to the people who wrote it, I think there's a certain lack of thoroughness in the preparation for this whole process. You know, if you look at our common agenda, the SG, actually, I think it's a really comprehensive and a strong document. And the, you know, the overarching message from the Secretary-General is the need to be multilateral and multi-stakeholder. Now, I think that's legitimate. What I don't see in the discussion around the Global Digital Compact and the Digital Cooperation Forum is serious work that looks at the complexity of multi-stakeholder processes, that actually, you know, works with evidence on what we've learned in the last 20 years, and what works and what doesn't work. You know, looking at the Net Mundial, looking at the IGF, looking at other processes, looking at the ICANN model, looking at the ITU Council Working Group discussions. And I think it completely simplifies its approach to multi-stakeholder with this tripartite model. I think it completely overlooks the value and the grind work of having a bottom-up process, as we've managed to establish with the IGF, and with all its imperfections. People own the IGF. The IGF is created not by the UN, but by communities who participate in it, who fill in those horrible forms for workshop applications, people like Bill Drake. And I think I don't see that seriousness of actually building on what has come before, learning from lessons that has been, learned. And that I find very disappointing, actually. I agree with Fiona. I think the WGIC definition of internet governance is sufficiently broad. Maybe it needs to be broader. Maybe there is a need for a new forum. Maybe there is a need for multilateral processes to talk about decision-making. But whatever the next steps are, we still need the IGF. We need a space where there's broad-based public participation, a space for learning, a space for new people to enter the debate, a space that's not intimidating. And I don't really see any respect. I'm sorry to use this word, but I don't see real respect coming from this initiative for the 20 years of practice from the IGF, or maybe it's not quite 20 years, but actually of the whole post-versus period. I think that, we've learned so much at national level and also at global and regional level, and I don't see that reflected in this initiatives. Why? I don't know. I think the UN, in spite of my 2 years as a chair of the UN IGF Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, I find it very difficult to understand why the IGF does not implement recommendations that it makes itself about how to strengthen its own processes. Why? Where are the bottlenecks? Where are the barriers? I'm not sure I understand that. But I'm convinced that if we don't build on what we've achieved so far, if we don't look at what ITU has done, what UNESCO has done, ICANN, ISOC, IGF, etc., the entire WSIS process, then we're not really going to do anything more than establish just one more parallel process that's not likely to really have significant results. And I think, well, just one thing, I think that, if you look at what Ambassador Gill says, I agree with him. There is a need for greater accountability by states and by corporations. I'm just not convinced that this is going to give us that greater accountability.
Thanks. Very well put, Henriette. Nigel.
Yes, thank you very much. And there's a lot going on in the chat as well. Some really great remarks. I love the sort of notion of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the upper chamber and the lower chamber. I don't recommend that following the UK model, but there we go. But 4 points really. first of all, I read the report twice, I think, with the Secretary-General's issue report. And, first off, I mean, let's say it's good to have a report of this nature. And I think it did display, as I said earlier, a real sort of an angst here that the UN should be able to respond to some of the wishes of perhaps of the members. But I think it, in some places, I wouldn't say it was flawed. I mean, it's not up to me to say things like that. But certainly in reflecting on the hub and spoke model, I think it didn't really give due credence for the bodies, as Henriette and others and Fiona have said, that have existed for so long and have got such a history when we consider the UN IGF since 2006 and other bodies at all. And ICANN have actually written quite a good blog on this and some of their takes on some of the elements of that report. And yes, the Digital Cooperation Forum, I mean, it's interesting to read about it. And quite clearly, if there is going to be a global digital compact, and I think the assumption has to be that there will be something, it might be something that's fairly high level. But if it says anything at all, then it will have to have some sort of body to at least be able to discuss what progress governments and other stakeholders have made on some of the main issues that it identifies after the Summit of the Future next year. So it will need some sort of body to take stock of that. But I can't see it. I can't see how this body is going to really interplay with some of the other existing bodies we have. And when it comes to the UN IGF, I mean, I've heard the ambassador talk about this, and he's been asked about this. I mean, he was asked at RightsCon, he was asked the other day in the European Dialogue on Internet Governance in Finland, where there was a discussion on WSIS and the GDC. And he quite clearly said that he sees the UN IGF as continuing and being a force for discussion. But then, it's very unclear how it would link to the Digital Cooperation Forum. And I think, this is just fundamentally different. I mean, here we have such an incredible network, such an incredible national and regional network of youth IGFs, of country IGFs, of regional IGFs, and they're bottom up. I mean, all right, they're not always bottom up in all aspects, but in many cases, stakeholders are coming together and deciding on agendas. And we see this in the UN IGF. And as Henriette said, yes. I mean, can you imagine an IGF taking place this year that didn't discuss artificial intelligence? I mean, there are going to be discussions on artificial intelligence. No one is going to say, is this an internet governance issue or is this a digital issue? These things are going to be discussed. And this reflects the real aspiration and needs and wants of other people. The third thing I think is in relation to what's going on in New York and Geneva, and clearly perhaps there is a feeling in New York that they need to seize the initiative here to an extent. But we can't just forget the historical situation we're in, and we can't just forget the incredible work that's done in Geneva across a number of different bodies. So I think. In terms of Digital Cooperation Forum, a lot of thinking will have to be done.
Thanks, Nigel. I just want to pick up on some of the points quickly, and then we'll do one more question, then open it up. Thinking about this relationship with IGF, I mean, I can't help dealing with the reality that there's been a lot of criticism of the IGF that we've been listening to for years from some parties, and a lot of that criticism throughout the process, through the high-level panel and going forward, was being echoed in the context of the Global Digital Compact discussion. And we hear all the time, the IGF can't get anything done. It's not a decision-making forum, not fitting the need, and so on. And part of the problem, of course, is the reason that the IGF isn't, quote, stronger or, quote, getting something done is because the parties don't want it to. I mean, there's disagreements amongst states and stakeholders as to what being stronger and getting something done would mean. And it's not obvious to me why having a digital cooperation forum would overcome that. I mean, if you convene an annual meeting in New York do all the governments that are disagreeing about fundamentals in the IGF not disagree in New York? Would the democratic countries of the world and the autocracies of the world now come together on a shared vision of how to govern digital platforms or AI or whatever else in 193 something countries collaborating together? The mechanisms of this have just never been spelled out. And indeed, the description of the process itself is extremely schematic. So it's just sort of put out there that this is a thing that we'll do without any kind of looking backward at previous experiences and trying to learn from why other efforts haven't worked, and then advancing, now we'll do a new thing, it'll be under us and it'll work better. So leaving all that said, I mean, I think that the motivations are good, but it's not obvious to me yet about the practicality of it. Let me ask one more question and then we can open it up to the broader discussion. So far, no governments have spoken in favor of this. When the Secretary-General introduced it in the General Assembly, no governments said, we need this. This is great. Let's go. Countries have a lot of different agendas. Developing countries are very focused on the SDGs and not on some of the future and the digital stuff. Other countries are concerned about preserving the IGF. It's not clear whether this will get traction. In the event that it doesn't get traction, and we want to try to provide an alternative way for New York, for the Secretary-General to be engaged in doing something useful, inspired by this event, what are the options for taking forward these digital issues? Like in New York, I mean, in the past, we've had things like the UNICT task force. We've had proposals for different types of networks, things like that. Is there any kind of alternative way in which the UN could provide a more intergovernmental space that is not a forum and does not compete with the IGF, but is somehow useful? Alternatively, are there ways to just simply strengthen the IGF to meet all those needs so that they won't have this concern? What is your thinking about going forward? What are some ways of trying to get something positive out of this initiative and build consensus? Fiona, any thoughts?
Well, I was sort of wondering about that. Look, I think it helps raise the profile of the issue set, right? That's always a good thing. It's important that people have this conversation, it seems like, on a regular basis. I think I was struck by Henriette's earlier opening comments about the change in perception or interest in technology. Maybe 20 years ago was a little bit Pollyannish in terms of like, the internet and technology helping solve problems. And now we have some problems and we don't have tools to solve those problems or be able to keep up. So there's a perception of that. So maybe it helps build some political will, which is needed. But I do think, I was really surprised that the report didn't lean more into and reference the IGF plus model, since the process from last year or 2 years ago proposed that. So I think that was a little bit dispiriting from that perspective. So I think in response to this, I'm not sure there's going to be stakeholder feedback on this report as far as I can tell. I do know that the issue specific deep dives that they were having were not even completed before the report came out. So that's also kind of a process red flag for me. So I think it's important that, stakeholders, I guess, make their voices known and figure out what to do it, and maybe have some conversations about this leading into the IGF at the IGF in Kyoto to see if something can come out of the IGF that influences the process. But again, I really did think that the pivot a couple of years ago to IGF plus for most stakeholders and countries was going to be a good path forward. And I'm surprised it didn't appear in this report in the same way.
Fiona, the one thing I would note, though, is that the ministerial meeting that will take up this issue is in September and the IGF's in October.
Yeah, there's always a sequencing problem. The other thing that I might raise here as well is that, I think I've said this a couple of times in the last couple of years, which is one of the reasons that the IGF has been hobbled a little bit in its way and approach of dealing things is a lack of sustained funding. And I think it's probably time to revisit or actually have the conversation about making the IGF part of the regular UN budget. It wasn't at the time, at the behest of the US and other countries for various reasons, which we don't need to go into. But if you're really going to invest and you're really going to try to do these things, and even if you want to try to have New York be a monitoring system, as Andrea is suggesting in the chat, you can't do that without committed staff and time and expertise and resources. So I think that, you know, even if you want New York to do monitoring by the member states in the General Assembly via a one-day meeting, I mean, that seems not really a way to do monitoring. So I don't know. I think the modalities of the monitoring would need to be explained, but none of this works without sustained resources and funding anyway.
Okay, Henriette, your thoughts?
Shall I jump in? Bill, Fiona, I agree with all that. Bill, to go back to your question, I think, you know, that ship has sailed. I think digital is everywhere and everything is digital. I think this notion that we can centralize decision-making on digitalization and on policy and governance and regulation that relates to digital, that's gone. But that does not mean that there are certain principles that might be lacking. And I think there are. I think that we still are not really, you know, sure about what the internet is, for example. Is it as the Net Mundial said, it is a global public resource that should be managed in the public interest? You know, is it just a network of networks with lots of different stakeholders, government, the tech community, universities, you know, managing and building parts of it? I think there is a little bit of a gap there. And I think that's why we see the declaration of the future of the internet coming from the US. That's why we see the EU having its sets of instruments. But I don't think those instruments are helping us, because I think they are not rooted in that spirit of cooperation between everyone, you know, irrespective of where they stand in terms of sort of Cold War type polarity, which is sticking its ugly head out again. So there is a gap there. But I just, you know, as I said earlier, I'm not sure that the Global Digital Compact is taking us to a space where it's filling that gap. If it is, if it does, if we can actually come up with some very broad-based principles that address, for example, digital inequality. Digital inequality is, in my view, still the greatest problem that we face, much bigger problem than AI, you know, or even cyber insecurity. We still have less than half the world meaningfully connected to the internet. Now, if the Global Digital Compact can take us forward in getting agreement between governments on seriously addressing that, that would be good. And yes, then it should be monitored. The IGF can play a role. The UN General Assembly ICT for Development resolution that Fiona talked about can play a role. Human rights mechanisms can play a role. And I just don't see the GDC and this proposed digital cooperation forum moving towards that kind of very broad-based agreement to really take us forward. So, well, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think that I mean, and whatever happens, I think the IGF remains. I think, you know, and that's the strength of the IGF model. I know there are a lot of weaknesses in the IGF, but the strength of the IGF is that whatever happens elsewhere, it's a ready-made, constantly growing and evolving public participation space. And, you know, anyone who cares about good governance, whether it's multilateral, multi-stakeholder, or a combination of both, without good public participation, you will never have good governance. And that's why I find it so incredibly disappointing, and not just disappointing, worrying, that this initiative is not proactively building on that element of the IGF.
Great, thank you. Nigel.
Yeah, yes, thank you, and I'll be brief because it'll be good to see see people contribute. Has the ship sailed? Well, you know, we'll have to see, and it's a very interesting reflection in the chat, not just on the issue of whether internet should have a capital I or not, which I think we've had to give up on, unfortunately, but also, you know, what is the real alternative here? I mean, my water, you know, my gut feeling tells me that there is going to be something at the end of this process. There is going to be some global digital compact. Perhaps it will be high level principles, and therefore perhaps the Digital Cooperation Forum or whatever will essentially be be trying to understand what progress has been made in various areas, and perhaps that might have some merit. But what is the alternative? Well, the IGF is the alternative in terms of a body that, yes, needs reform, it needs money, it needs greater resources, it needs perhaps a slightly different modus operandi, but essentially it is this model that allows discussion, whether it's nationally, globally, or regionally, on a whole range of different issues. And I think it's something to be treasured in that respect. I really don't think that we can go forward on the basis that simply member states governments are going to give up on having some sort of multilateral process. But I don't think that we have to agree a multilateral process that's going to try and second guess all these bodies on the end of spokes, or whatever that model should be. And I just can't see that working in any sense at all. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nigel. Okay, well, we've come up to the top of the hour, and we have a lot of people here in the group who have a lot of experience around these issues. So I'd like to open it up to open discussion. We've got a half hour to play with. If people who are interested in contributing could just raise their hand and introduce themselves, say where they are in the universe and so on, that'd be great. And of course, try to limit yourself to, a couple of minutes so that we can get lots of voices in. Okay, we start with David Allen. David.
David Allen in Concord, Mass, actually, in the US, and the biographical information will come out in the comment. Looking back to the working group on enhanced cooperation and its failure, as has been related several times here, from my experience inside it, through all of it, there is a simple diagnosis. Bill put it very nicely. Democratic and autocratic governments couldn't agree. And because consensus was required, it wasn't going anywhere. And of course, the implication of that is that this is quintessentially a political discussion. Therefore, there is some reason to think about putting it in New York, where it is a political discussion. Are there problems with introducing the technology there? Well, if there are, then that's part of what has to be addressed to bring in the technology. Of course, this observation that New York needs to be the place, if my diagnosis is correct, doesn't address the details of what's been proposed here and whether or not it might get anywhere. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, David. You know what, why don't I take like 3 questions and then go back to the panel rather than going back each time, so people can cluster their thoughts to respond to several at once. Milton.
Yeah, I'm just struck through all these conversations.
Who are you?
Hello?
Who are you?
Who am I? You just named me. I am Milton Mueller. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, USA. So all of these conversations about the IGF or the role of various UN or multilateral agencies, there's 2 sort of elephants in the room that that I just want to identify. Number 1 is the fact that the UN is a bureaucracy that needs to justify its existence, and that many, if not all, of these initiatives are in effect the UN seeking relevance and finding a role for itself as an organization or as an institution, which, the correct answer may in fact be that there is no role for it beyond what it's already doing with the UN. The other elephant in the room is, people persistently overlook, what is the need for governance and what creates a need for it. So, for example, with ICANN, we have a global governance regime because you have a shared resource called the DNS root, and we have to agree on how to coordinate that. When you're talking about governance of the digital ecosystem, there is no single point of leverage. There is no clear objective. It's not clear what you're regulating. And so, things like the digital divide, for example, is all about economic development and whether people have the resources to acquire and whether people have the suppliers have the resources to produce less expensive digital devices and things and networks. So it is not clear in most of these cases why political governance through a nation state system is needed and why we can't rely on various forms of market governance or other kinds of social cooperation to bring about desired results without the top-down kind of approach of a UN agency. So I'm just like, really, why do we need any kind of a new UN initiative? And the final point is that, the IGF was specifically sold to us as, we don't need multilateral governance, we need dialogue. We need to bring people together to discuss what they can do in other forums. And I believe that original vision of the IGF was valid, and I don't know why people keep saying there's something wrong with it or there's some huge gap that needs to be filled.
Thanks. I think those two questions are both juicy enough that maybe we should go back to the panel now. So Hans and Steve, I'll come to you in a second and get people to react to that. So on the one hand, we have David saying it's political, why not be in New York? And on the other hand, Milton arguing that there's a public interest kind of, or public goods kind of explanation, rent-seeking, bureaucratic relevance seeking dynamic going on here at the UN, and a functional question about the actual need to do something. Can I get a response from the panelists? But did we lose Fiona somewhere? I'm not seeing her picture. Henriette, can you reply?
I'm not sure I can reply, Bill. I think Milton, I think that how you feel about nation state level governance versus, other levels of global governance really depends on where you sit and who you are. If in my case, where I still don't have adequate internet connectivity, and I don't have internet connectivity because there isn't enough infrastructure. And that is a result of market failure. It's a result of poor governance. So to me, what my nation state does still really matters. So, I think it's not an either or answer, Milton. I think that the UN is not going to deliver connectivity, but the UN could develop certain goals and targets, as it did in WSIS, and as the ITU is in fact trying to build on implementing. And so I think, Milton, what my answer to you is, the UN does have value. I think it is the only level playing field still. And I think Nigel said this really well. I'm not convinced that this process is building on the particular strengths of the UN, rather than on trying to create a new process, which I think could be just a parallel process and not add any particular value. So, for example, market failure. I don't see anything really in the Global Digital Compact or in the briefing paper that takes us to a point where we actually develop new incentives, new financial models, different ways of addressing the infrastructure gap and bridging the digital divide. It's just not specific enough. And I think that's probably part of the problem, that more generalities are not going to take us any further. I think we need to target very specific problems and work on them in specific ways, and not just have more sort of overarching good intention type compacts.
Thanks, Henriette. Fiona's network dropped off, but she'll be back in a second. Nigel, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for those comments, Milton and David. On the enhanced cooperation, I had the privilege of being a member of both those sort of working groups. And, you know, looking back, you do wonder whether, you know, we missed an opportunity to at least develop something, because as you rightly say, David, I mean, it was sort of political differences, of course, different approaches. And I suppose the concern that many of us had, and I was working for ICANN at the time, that, you know, that we didn't want to, you know, the Tunis agenda to unravel. We didn't want, you know, the hard-fought gains that had been adopted in 2005 to somehow go backwards. But yeah, you know, it was an interesting process for that reason. I think, you know, Milton, you know, yeah, I mean, we can say what we like and think what we like about the UN, of course, but I think it's natural that in the UN, in the same way that the UN Secretary-General is worried, obviously, about climate change and about disasters and about other political issues, is it also wants to reflect, you know, concerns on digital. So I suspect that, you know, it's not going to be something that is forgotten about. And indeed, you know, we you know, we want to use the UN when it's being used for us as the governments in a positive way. We want to say to the UN, look, you know, do more to fund the IGF or do more to enhance resources here and there. So, you know, I think we have to be consistent in our thoughts, but that doesn't mean to say that we have to agree things which are just not going to work and you know, betray the sense of logic entirely.
Thanks for that, Nigel. I just want to emphasize one thing from Milton's question. I think it's easy to talk about the political issue and the question of bureaucratic interests and all that. But the other aspect of what Milton said, I think, is really something to keep an eye on. What is the functional demand for governance and cooperation, right? And yet, as he noted, okay, in the case of the DNS, yes, there was undeniably a need to do something. In the case of radio frequency spectrum, there's undeniably a need to do something. There are issue areas where you undeniably have problems of commons and so on, where absent some governance framework, you know, you're going to have significant problems. Whether there are particular spaces in the broad digital environment that also meet that criteria has not been in any way addressed in the process of putting forward this proposal. So it leaves you wondering exactly what is the concept of what role would be played and how they would be responsive to that issue. Why does it have to be dealt with in this way? Why would addressing those issues in this setting not lead to the deadlocks that killed the working group and enhanced cooperation twice, for example? These are all outstanding issues. I see more hands. So Hans, you've been waiting patiently.
Okay, thank you, Bill. My name is Hans Klein. I'm at Georgia Tech. I'm a colleague of Milton's at the School of Public Policy in Atlanta in the USA. I want to ask a big picture question, put this in the context of a big picture bigger than the internet. We're seeing a shift in general, perhaps, towards away from globalization, towards internationalization, away from an emphasis on civil society and private governance, towards sovereignty and geopolitics and international relations rather than global economic relations. So I'm wondering if this larger trend that we're seeing isn't being manifested here in the details here with the internet, because we're seeing some of the building blocks of multi-stakeholderism of the internet. Things like private governance has arguably been weaponized as firms are enrolled in state strategies. We're seeing private companies like Microsoft. In the case of Ukraine, Microsoft is actually getting actively involved in the international relations there, in the conflict in the Ukraine. Sorry, I'm getting a little nervous here. You know, this civil society, which is a building block of multi-stakeholderism, is certainly being criticized in some quarters, Russia and China, as having played an important role in the destabilization of Ukraine that led to its war. So if some of these building blocks that are the foundations of multi-stakeholderism, private governance, civil society, a trade-based paradigm for international relations, if that's generally being challenged particularly in the events in Ukraine, we're seeing a shift towards realpolitik, sovereignty, geopolitics. That's the big picture. Is that what we're seeing here in the case of the Global Digital Compact? Is this just a manifestation of these larger trends away from globalization, away from multi-stakeholderism, towards geopolitics and towards multilateralism? That's my question.
Okay, that's a sufficiently juicy question in itself that I think we should go back to the panel before digging into Siva and Eileen and Mike's questions. Anybody want to take that on? A shift away from globalization towards more interstate geopolitical conflict, and that driving this process or impacting this process. Henriette?
Hans, I think yes and no. In fact, I think the shift is real. I agree with you. I think that shift is there. I'm not sure that this process is actually effectively or intelligently enough speaking to that, which is probably why it might not succeed. I think it's a product of it rather than, in my view, a very coherent response to it.
Okay. Nigel?
Oh, is Fiona might be back. Would she like to go first? I thought I saw her. No. Nope.
She says she's having data cap issues because her Wi-Fi's out.
Oh, no. That's the problem.
We were worried about Henriette being in South Africa with power outages. Fiona in DC has lost connectivity. So there you go. Anyway.
There you go. It's part of the trend. Yeah, no, I mean, just two brief points. I totally agree. I think we are seeing geopolitical shifts. I mean, you know, I certainly experienced it in the UK, the time I was away from the government. I mean, I think there's, you know, the geopolitical issues that in play here are you know, are very prominent, and you know, to an extent that manifests itself in, of course, multilateral arrangements and agreements and whatever. But at the same time, you know, and I know sometimes, you know, we can't go back and use the pandemic as our only example, but you know, it did show there that, you know, we're all in this bucket together, so to speak, and the less stakeholders work together, then you don't make the progress you should. And we certainly experienced this in the UK, in that some of the early decisions perhaps, you know, were not as good as some of the later decisions when, you know, stakeholders and experts were involved. So, you know, I think we're into different shifts, and it'll be interesting to see how the AI, you know, the governance of the AI works out in this context. You know, whether it's going to be like climate change or whether it's going to be like some other model.
Right. Thanks. Well, I certainly think that the trend towards more geopolitical conflict in the internet space is going to sharply limit what could be achieved in a digital cooperation forum, to put it mildly. But that's my own view. Siva, you want to go ahead? Siva, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. The central and most fundamental debate.
Siva, could you say who you are and where you are?
Yeah. Okay. I'm Siva Subramanian from India. I've been a participant in internet governance for a long time. The central debate about internet governance so far has been multilateral versus multi-stakeholder processes. And what was distinctive about the multi-stakeholder process is that it's participative and accessible governance process whereby decisions are made openly. And this distinction is what separated the multi-stakeholder process from the multilateral process. And governments in the multilateral process initially responded by completely ignoring the multi-stakeholder process. Then by coming into the process with from an elevated ground, visibly and invisibly. And of late, I think the conflict is reconciled for the worse by making the distinction between multilateral process and the multi-stakeholder process completely disappear. I met the internet leader at the ICANN meeting who was ruminating and said ICANN, which symbolizes the multi-stakeholder process in some sense, works very differently now than 10 years ago. It over a process of managing $150 million with 150 staff, it has become bureaucratic. And this is the greatest danger for the multi-stakeholder process in that it almost becomes like a government-like process, and it's easier for the multilateral process to capture the multi-stakeholder process. They don't have to worry about multilateral or multi-stakeholder. Both are going to be the same. Is that good reading? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Siva. By the way, Siva and Hans, you can lower your hands after you intervene. Let's take one more and then we'll come back to the group. Let Fiona get her bearings here. Eileen, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Eileen Donahoe, I'm based at Stanford, and it is great to see so many faces from the past. I want to go back to some of the comments at the top, two different insights. Fiona, your point about terminology and we've being part of the problem here. And what do people mean by the internet governance, or are we really or some people are talking about governance of the global digital ecosystem, sort of writ large, digitized society. Henriette, you sort of said that it's everything. And different people are talking about different things. I think that, and several people, Milton brought this up, if we're talking about the technical interoperability standards that create the network of networks, that made sense to have multi-stakeholder. The debates that are happening now at the UN or that are part of this process are more about what's happening on the internet. It's not up, it's that original distinction with Vint Cerf and everybody. And those things are inherently more political. They're not, merit-based things. And there's wide disagreement. And so I think also, to Henriette's point at the top, a decade ago, earlier days, we were focused more on the benefits of the internet and connecting everybody. And now there is so much emphasis on risk. And again, that points us more to a role for states, as certainly compared to the technical community and even the civil society community, because there's this sense that states are responsible for providing security, and that this is digital is now society writ large. And so states are feeling more empowered to jump into that conversation. And I think those two things are happening at the same time. And that's a big part of why the center of the multilateral system is feeling more energized to have this be state focused. I am very worried about that, though, for another reason that Henriette mentioned. You talked about, the ideal is greater participation is the only way you have good outcomes. And even though by going to the UN, you may be getting more governments involved, there's no question you are losing the voices of civil society and citizens, because there's sort of a democracy deficit at the UN itself because it's so state focused, and there is no real vehicle for incorporating citizen voices. So I think that's a real problem with this move. And my sense is that civil society has been hoping to bring multi-stakeholder process to the entirety of internet governance or governance of digital society, not just the DNS level kind of processes. And that is what is probably could be lost in this process. All that said, I still think it's going to end up with a high level of generality. maybe kind of much ado about nothing. I'm not sure where it goes, because I'm not sure the states can decide anything more significant and have consensus anyway.
Thanks, Eileen. Certainly, when you were ambassador, I think you experienced the fact that governments don't necessarily agree on these things. So the fact that we shift from governance of to governance on doesn't mean that there may be demand for discussion, doesn't mean there's going to be greater ability to generate outcomes. Anyway, we've got Fiona back. Fiona, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sure. And sorry for that. I was having some connection problems here at my house. So I think just listening to Eileen's comments, and look, there's a lot of people on this call that have worked on various aspects of these issues for a long time and have lots of different opinions. But I will just flag that this whole idea of governance of the internet and governance on the internet was a theme that was flagged ages ago. I kind of want to say Bertrand kind of claimed it, but I don't know who came up with the theory of these divisions. Bill's telling me no. Yeah, exactly. I'm not quite sure.
Surf, and he did a paper with Max Sengus and somebody else.
Not him either, but a lot of people have talked about it and written about it. But I will just say that, you know, when I was at NTA, we flagged this as an issue and a challenge to ask the question, could the governance on the internet problems be resolved or addressed through multi-stakeholder processes? And at NTA, during that cycle, we actually tried, right? We held a bunch of multi-stakeholder processes on privacy and cybersecurity because we were trying to actually live this domestically as well as preaching it internationally and, you know, working through the ICANN system. So I don't agree necessarily with Eileen that governance on the internet means states have more of a say or that these issues can't be resolved in a multi-stakeholder format. I don't think people have been incentivized to actually participate or solve the problems. And this goes back to the question about the IGF plus, right? You know, if you have a stakeholder community, if you have all these places where people get together and talk about them, why aren't we actually getting problems resolved in an IGF environment, an IGF plus environment? I have zero faith that a conversation in New York where geopolitics will take over the issue will bring any solution to any of these issues. I have zero faith that, you know, I mean, and this is saying a lot given the fact that I negotiated a lot of these principles, you know, implementation of these principles doesn't actually happen at a member state level. So it doesn't resolve the problem. So I don't necessarily feel like, you know, shifting the conversation to a multilateral framework, which sort of gives a nod to multi-stakeholder, but completely undermines multi-stakeholder is the way to solve the problem.
Just let me be clear. I want to make sure nobody thinks that's what I think. I'm saying that's what I'm worried about. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. It should, the real ideal is that multi-stakeholder process deals with all these levels. But I think the dynamic is that it's empowering states to think they play a bigger role, and that's in that direction.
Right. And I think it's not, I mean, I think it's all states. I mean, I think Western democracies have kind of fallen into this as well. So I guess the bigger question I go back to is, why is the IGF not solving these problems? Why are we not shifting to an IGF plus model? I don't think that this global digital compact conversation and a global digital forum is going to shift us away that way.
Others want to get on also, and picking up Siva's question about, you know, the blurring, the bureaucratization of multi-stakeholder and the blurring of these different mechanisms. Nigel or Henrietta, anybody?
I just had, you know, two very quick points because we've got other questioners. I mean, I fully agree. This is a real difficulty, and we are seeing this shift. And I think Eileen, you know, captured that this is happening, and I think we as governments, you know, have to take some responsibility here. We have to, you know, we have to stand up and be counted. And you know, something that I would love to say in the ITU Council this coming July, and I probably won't say it at all, but you know, we can't go round calling the ITU in any sense multi-stakeholder if they don't allow, you know, stakeholders into the room when they're discussing internet public policy issues. It just doesn't wash, and we have to be honest about this. And it's the same in the Global Digital Cooperation Forum, when I heard that, you know, this tripart agreement that somehow stakeholders are going to be allowed to set the agenda, but then not discuss what's on the agenda. I mean, this is, you know, this is taking me back to the 1970s and early 1980s in governments when, you know, we put out consultation documents and never listened to, never really read, you know, what came in, but we have consulted, dear boy, you know, we have consulted, but, you know, we can't allow this to happen.
Thanks, Nigel. Henriette, and then we'll go to a last question from Mike.
I mean, maybe not a response, but just, and Nigel, not to disagree with you, but I don't want to, not everything can be multi-stakeholder. When we're looking at accountability of states and holding states accountable as the duty bearers for upholding and promoting human rights, we need to be able to do that. You know, as non-state actors, as citizens, we have to be able to do that. Similarly, states have agreed to the GGE norms on responsible behavior in cyberspace. We need to hold them accountable. Similarly, we need to be able to hold corporations accountable. So I think that multi-stakeholder processes are a very, very important part of the whole ecosystem, but the ecosystem is more complex than that. And once we look at accountability for specific roles and responsibilities, the multi-stakeholder process is a part of that, but it should never actually, I feel, dilute the specific accountabilities of states, specific accountabilities of corporations or other actors who have, you know, specific roles and responsibilities.
Thanks, Henriette. Mike, you've been waiting patiently, so you get the last question before we shut down the show. So go ahead.
Lloyd Benson, our former Treasury Secretary, used to say, never take the last question. And this may be the worst one because it's the hardest one. It's really the third elephant to add to Milton's list. And that is that it's not just that different governments disagree. Within each government, you'll have 3 or 4 agencies all thinking they're in charge of an issue, all pulling in different directions. And the worst thing is each of those governments, agencies, will go to separate UN organizations and argue their case. And so my question for you is whether we might see some progress on that problem. Is there something that Guterres, as a former prime minister, could do to get governments to coalesce? Just to take one issue, if you talk about online copyright, you've got all the librarians and the culture ministers going off to UNESCO, arguing for more free, fair use, and you have all the content holders and patent and trademark agencies running off to WIPO, going in just the opposite direction. So is there any reason we could be optimistic about getting more coherent answers from each government? And is there any government you think has actually done a better job of this? Because it seems that it's getting worse and worse, not better and better.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody want to come back on that one from the panel? Fiona?
I mean, I could speak to my own experience, and Eileen, a former ambassador, is on. I think there's a current State Department colleague that's on. I will just offer that when I first started doing my job at NTIA in 2000, there were 3 agencies or departments that were kind of critical to the work that I worked on, and getting agreement amongst those 3 departments was challenging enough sometimes. And the White House would convene a meeting to resolve issues if needed. And one of those agencies was independent and not even part of the executive branch. For those of you familiar with the US system, when I left the government, I think no meeting had less than 18 agencies at the table. So Mike, I unfortunately do not see that getting any better going forward. I've been a big proponent for a long time, at least in the US system, of trying to reconcile this and actually do some mergers and recreate some or create some new departments and agencies. Everyone always tells me that's too big of an ask and it's too difficult. And it's complicated and compounded by the fact that different congressional committees oversee the existing groups. So I will just say that that has actually only gotten worse since my time in government, at least over the course of my 20 years there. But others from other governments might have views. And I don't know if Eileen is on, and I think I saw Justin on, who's currently in US government. Maybe he can't comment, but I don't see that getting better, Mike.
And we won't talk about the 7 or 8 different courts and judges who then get involved too. Thanks.
Bill, can I just jump in quickly to respond to Mike? I think that's a brilliant example, Mike. And I think that's why I'm not convinced that the GDC process has done its homework adequately, because there are UN agreements on copyright. And as you say, there are different ones in different institutions, and they're being used at national level. I've worked myself on copyright legislation in South Africa to produce an act which is very, pro-open content and access to knowledge, which introduced fair use, because it's a good example from the US. And the EU has been lobbying my government to take that out of our copyright legislation. So I think that there's a lot of this happening already in the background. The UN is involved. And I think that there is a need for common principles, yes, but approaching it at this very sort of big picture, overarching way, without actually looking at the nuts and bolts that have been in place for the last 20 odd years, is just going to result in one more parallel process, lots of noise, and not necessarily achieving any positive results. And noise is bad. And this will be my last comment, Bill. Noise for me in this space is bad, because I think there are fundamental problems, digital inequality being, in my view, the greatest one. And I think that these processes detract attention of governments from dealing with those basic problems. And that's not helpful.
Great. Nigel, did you want to say anything, or?
No, I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Well, then we're out of time. So I want to thank everybody for a very interesting discussion. I guess my own view is that, bottom line, irrespective of anything we talk about here, they are working on a issue paper over the summer that will be presented to the ministerial meeting in September. And I'm hopeful that in the time between now and then that there will be expressions of views raising concerns about exactly how this will be done, so that, and maybe those might be taken on board, although it's not clear how. I've seen no indication of any intention to have real consultation and take on board inputs from the global community about this. Hopefully we don't end up with just another entry into the cabinet of forgotten UN documents, and actually what is produced ends up being useful in some manner, whether we have a forum or some other kind of process to engage governments more than they have been so far, and at the same time preserve the space for the IGF to serve its unique role that can't be reproduced through an intergovernmental mechanism. So I stop there. Thank you all again, and I turn to Ellie. Ellie, would you like to close?
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was an important topic, a great panel, an excellent discussion. Of the 6 or so bullet points that I said in the beginning, I was satisfied to hear about 5 of them. The one that I'm still listening to and hope to learn is what's the private sectors, the tech industry, the infrastructure providers, the innovators, what is their perspective on all this? After all, they are affected. And so I'd like to thank the organizers who did a fabulous job. Bill Drake, who organized this and conceived it and introduced it and led it, and Jason Buckwitz, who toiled in the background to make all of this technically possible and are administratively possible. So thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, panel, and thank you, audience. Talk to you next.
Okay.
Bill, what is next?
What is next? This summer in the north, winter in the fall.
We're taking a winter break.
And we'll go from there. Okay.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.